It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, on the global radar. Ships idling off the coast, cranes standing still, and 7 of the world's busiest ports suddenly refusing to load or unload cargo bound for the United States. Headlines flashed, West Coast import volumes collapse, blank sailings surge as trade spat escalates. Within days, factory floors fell silent, store shelves thinned, and Wall Street bled billions in a single week. Economists whispered the same phrase, supply chain fracture. But this isn't a story of storms or sabotage. It's the tale of a tariff war spiraling out of control, one that neither side can afford to lose. So the question is, how did we get here? For decades, North America's trade relationship was a model of integration and efficiency. The United States and Canada, bound by the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and later the USMCA, built a logistics network so seamless that goods could cross the border multiple times in the course of production. Automobiles assembled in Ontario would carry engines from Michigan, electronics from Asia unloaded in Vancouver, and raw materials from Alberta. Ports like Los Angeles, Vancouver, and Prince Rupert acted as arteries for a continental economy that seemed immune to the world's disruptions. For manufacturers, retailers, and consumers on both sides, the flow felt inevitable, steady, predictable, and mutually beneficial. The cracks began to show in the mid-2020s. U.S. policymakers, under growing domestic pressure, started re-evaluating trade balances and dependency on foreign suppliers, even those in allied countries. Tariff threats became more than political theater. They were enacted. Initially targeted at China and other Asian exporters, the levies began creeping toward Canadian goods, igniting concern in Ottawa. Meanwhile, global shipping itself was under strain. Container shortages, rising fuel prices, and climate-related port disruptions added volatility to a system built for stability. By early 2025, political rhetoric had hardened into policy. The U.S. introduced sweeping tariff hikes on a range of imports, from steel to consumer electronics, framing it as a defense of American industry. Canada, which had long relied on the predictability of its southern neighbor's market, suddenly faced a trade environment in flux. And then came the breaking point. In July, 7 of the world's busiest ports, including key Asian and North American gateways, halted U.S.-bound shipments entirely, not because of strikes, storms, or accidents, but as a direct, deliberate response to escalating tariffs. The golden era of unbroken flow had ended, replaced by a climate of suspicion and strategic retaliation. The decision that set this crisis in motion was made in Washington, but its shockwaves reached every corner of the Pacific Rim. In mid-2025, the U.S. administration announced an aggressive escalation of its tariff policy. Rates on certain imported goods, particularly electronics, automotive components, and consumer durables, jumped from 10 to 15% to as high as 35%. While the rhetoric framed it as a strategic safeguard for American jobs, the scope told a more complex story. The tariffs were not limited to traditional rivals like China. They extended to allies, including Canada, Japan, and South Korea, whose ports serve as essential transshipment hubs for goods ultimately destined for U.S. shores. Officials in the Commerce Department argued that this was the logical extension of the America First economic doctrine. They pointed to the U.S. trade deficit, still hovering around $850 billion annually, as evidence that America's industrial base was bleeding out. "We can't rebuild our factories if we keep importing cheap parts," one senior advisor said in a press conference. The administration's strategy was to force companies to reshore manufacturing by making imports too expensive to compete. The immediate effect was a surge in front-loading, importers rushing to bring in goods before the tariffs took effect. July saw an unusual spike in cargo volumes, with over 2.3 million TEUs arriving at American ports, a level not seen since pre-pandemic peaks. But logistics experts warned this was a mirage, not a rebound. As soon as the new rates kicked in, the economics of shipping to the U.S. collapsed for many exporters. Shipping lines began canceling voyages, what the industry calls blank sailings, at a rate 13% higher than the same time the previous year. On some Pacific routes, cancellations approached 28%. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which together handle about 40% of all U.S. containerized imports, felt the impact almost immediately. By August, Los Angeles reported a 31% drop in inbound container volume compared to the previous year. For high-value goods like consumer electronics and automotive parts, the decline was even steeper, over 35%. Warehouses in the Inland Empire stood partially empty, not because inventory was moving quickly, but because it wasn't arriving at all. From Washington's perspective, this was acceptable collateral damage. Advisors insisted the pain would be temporary, predicting domestic manufacturers would ramp up to fill the gap. But that prediction clashed with reality. Rebuilding supply chains is not a matter of months, it's years, even decades. Many American factories rely on specialized components that have no domestic equivalents. Without them, assembly lines stall, and stall they did. By early September, automakers in Michigan and Ohio began announcing temporary layoffs, citing critical part shortages. Retailers, particularly those dependent on seasonal goods, faced grim projections for the holiday season. Even the agricultural sector, which the administration had vowed to protect, began to feel pressure. Fertilizers and farm equipment components, much of which are imported, saw price spikes of 15 to 20% in a matter of weeks. Still, the administration doubled down. Short-term disruption for long-term sovereignty became the mantra. Critics warned that the policy was less a surgical strike and more a blunt instrument, one that alienated allies and weakened America's position in global trade negotiations. But in Washington, the calculus was clear. Retreating from the tariffs would be seen as political surrender. The White House was willing to gamble that American resilience would outlast the world's patience. If Washington's tariff escalation was a calculated gamble, Ottawa saw it as a direct provocation. Canada's government had weathered U.S. trade pressure before: softwood lumber disputes, dairy quotas, even the bruising renegotiation of NAFTA into USMCA, but this was different. The new U.S. tariffs were sweeping, hitting not just raw materials but finished goods and key exports like automotive parts, electronics, and even certain agricultural products. For a country where 75% of exports head south, it was an economic body blow. Prime Minister's office aides described the mood as controlled fury. Canada's cabinet convened an emergency trade committee within hours of the U.S. announcement. The first question wasn't if they would respond, but how hard. Retaliation was inevitable. The challenge was to craft a response that inflicted pain without crippling Canada's own industries. The decision, unveiled just days later, was both bold and symbolic. Canada would coordinate with a group of major global ports, several in Asia, one in Europe, and its own West Coast hubs, to halt or slow the movement of U.S.-bound cargo. This wasn't a blanket blockade. Essential goods like food and medical supplies were exempt. But for consumer goods, industrial components, and high-value electronics, the message was blunt. If you tax our trade, we can choke yours at the source. The inclusion of non-Canadian ports was a strategic masterstroke. Vancouver and Prince Rupert alone could not dent U.S. trade volumes significantly. But when major shipping hubs in Asia joined in, ports that serve as critical transshipment points for goods bound for the United States, the effect was immediate and severe. Shipping schedules unraveled. Cargo already at sea was diverted, delayed, or held offshore. Importers scrambled to reroute shipments through smaller, less equipped ports, driving up costs and creating weeks-long delays. Publicly, Canadian officials framed the move as a necessary defense of rules-based trade. Privately, they knew it was a high-stakes bet. Canada's own exporters were collateral damage in this standoff. Goods that required U.S. components stalled in warehouses. Auto plants in Ontario faced the same parts shortages as those in Michigan. Yet, Ottawa's calculus was clear. To concede without retaliation would invite more aggressive U.S. trade measures in the future. Business leaders were split. Some manufacturing executives applauded the government's resolve, arguing that only firm pushback could restore a sense of parity in the relationship. Others warned that prolonged disruption would send investment fleeing to more predictable markets. "We can't run just-in-time supply chains on political brinkmanship," one CEO told the Financial Post. Meanwhile, Canadian labor unions seized the moment to pressure for reshoring of production. Striking a similar note to U.S. rhetoric, they argued that domestic manufacturing could fill the gaps if imports remained unstable. But industry analysts cautioned that Canada's manufacturing capacity was already stretched thin and deeply intertwined with cross-border supply chains. Any effort to fully go it alone would be slow, costly, and likely incomplete. For ordinary Canadians, the impact was less abstract. Electronics prices spiked, home renovation projects stalled for lack of imported materials, and grocery costs edged upward, particularly for goods trucked in from the U.S. The public's patience was tested, but polling suggested a narrow majority still backed the government's stance, viewing it as a matter of national dignity as much as economics. As the summer dragged on, the situation calcified. Neither side blinked. Canada had shown it was willing to weaponize its position in the global shipping network, and the U.S. had signaled it would absorb short-term pain to defend its policy. The stage was set for a prolonged standoff in which both economies would bleed slowly, waiting to see who would break first. By early autumn 2025, the trade confrontation had hardened into a deadlock. The flurry of press conferences, emergency meetings, and behind-the-scenes diplomacy had given way to a tense, grinding status quo. 7 major global ports remained partially or fully closed to U.S.-bound cargo. Container volumes into America's west coast stayed down by more than 30%, while Canadian exporters faced their own bottlenecks and mounting costs. Negotiators from both sides met quietly in neutral venues, Geneva, Singapore, but neither brought concessions to the table. Washington refused to roll back tariffs, insisting the strategy was non-negotiable for economic sovereignty. Ottawa, backed by sympathetic trading partners, maintained that lifting the port restrictions without reciprocal tariff relief would be tantamount to surrender. The result was a policy loop. Tariffs provoked port blockages. Port blockages reinforced the perceived need for tariffs. Shipping companies, caught in the middle, adjusted by rerouting cargo through secondary ports, raising freight costs and extending delivery times from days to weeks. Supply chains that had taken decades to refine were now operating in a permanent state of detour. The economic strain deepened. U.S. manufacturers delayed product launches due to missing components. Canadian retailers cut back on inventory orders ahead of the holiday season, bracing for shortages. And consumers on both sides of the border watched prices creep higher on everything from electronics to winter coats without any sign of relief. It was, in every sense, a lose-lose scenario. The fight had moved past immediate leverage and into the realm of endurance, with each government betting that the other's political will would crack first. In Surrey, British Columbia, a mid-sized electronics distributor called Westpac Imports had been thriving for nearly 2 decades. Their business model depended on a steady stream of components arriving from South Korea and Japan through the port of Vancouver, many of which were assembled into finished products and then shipped south to U.S. retailers. It was a system fine-tuned for speed and predictability until July 2025. When Canada joined the coalition of ports blocking U.S.-bound cargo, Westpac found itself in a paradoxical bind. The goods they imported still flowed in, but the final leg to their biggest customers across the border became a logistical nightmare. Shipments that once took 48 hours to clear customs and reach Seattle were now stranded in storage for weeks. The rerouting through smaller inland crossings added thousands of dollars in freight costs per container. By September, Westpac's warehouse was stacked floor to ceiling with inventory they couldn't move. Some contracts with U.S. clients were canceled outright, others imposed penalty clauses for late delivery. Revenue for Q3 dropped 37% compared to the previous year, forcing layoffs in a company that had never cut staff before. The ripple effects extended beyond corporate balance sheets. In the Fraser Valley, local trucking firms lost key contracts, idling fleets that once shuttled goods daily to Washington state. The slowdown in freight traffic meant fewer shifts for dock workers at Vancouver, who were already contending with reduced throughput as ships bypassed the port in favor of non-blockading routes. Canadian policymakers knew there would be domestic casualties in this strategy, but the speed and severity of the impact caught them off guard. Reports from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce warned that small and medium enterprises, especially those integrated into U.S. supply chains, were disproportionately at risk. Yet, despite mounting business pressure, Ottawa stood firm, betting that the long-term political gain of resisting U.S. tariffs outweighed the short-term economic pain. For communities like Surrey, the calculation felt cold. The blockade was a geopolitical statement, but on the ground it was a stack of unpaid invoices, empty loading bays, and workers wondering how long they could hold out. South of the border, in Toledo, Ohio, a family-owned auto parts manufacturer called Lakeshore Components was experiencing a similar unraveling. The company specialized in precision assemblies for mid-sized SUVs, a segment that had exploded in popularity. About 40% of their production relied on specialized fasteners and electronic control units imported from suppliers in Asia, routed through the Port of Los Angeles. When the port restrictions took effect, those components didn't just arrive late, they didn't arrive at all. The Asian suppliers, unable to get clearance for U.S.-bound cargo through the participating ports, either canceled orders or shipped them through costly alternative channels that added weeks to delivery times. The delays created cascading production stoppages. One missing part could halt an entire assembly line. By late August, Lakeshore was forced to furlough nearly 20% of its workforce. Orders from automakers like Ford and GM were delayed or reduced, straining long-term contracts. The irony wasn't lost on Lakeshore's CEO. The tariffs intended to protect American manufacturing were, in practice, crippling it. The consumer side felt the sting as well. With automakers producing fewer vehicles, prices for popular models climbed. Dealers reported shrinking inventories and rising demand for used cars, pushing the average used vehicle price above $30,000 for the first time in over a year. Meanwhile, electronics retailers saw prices for imported goods, particularly laptops, smartphones, and gaming consoles, jump by double digits in a matter of weeks. Households already stretched by inflation now faced higher costs on everyday goods. A mid-range washing machine that retailed for $799 in June was selling for $929 by September. For many families, the squeeze was both financial and psychological, a reminder that the supply chain was not an abstract concept, but the invisible scaffolding of daily life. American businesses lobbied aggressively for relief, but Washington's stance remained unyielding. The administration argued that short-term hardship was the price of reclaiming industrial independence. Yet, as the months dragged on, the question grew louder in boardrooms and households alike: independence from whom and at what cost? The blockade of 7 major ports has become more than a trade dispute. It is now a defining stress test for the economic interdependence of the U.S. and Canada. What began as a sharp exchange of tariffs and countermeasures has calcified into a stalemate that neither side can afford, yet neither seems willing to break. The damage is visible: idled workers, delayed shipments, rising prices, and fraying trust across one of the world's most integrated borders. Both governments face the same dilemma: back down and appear weak, or press on and risk deeper economic harm. Somewhere between national pride and practical necessity lies the path forward, but who will take the first step? If you found this breakdown valuable, please like the video, leave your comment, and subscribe to the channel.